August the 3rd, 1897. Hawthorne Creek, a small, forgotten settlement buried deep within the forests of New Hampshire. A place where time itself seemed frozen, where whispers carried further than footsteps, and secrets were buried deeper than roots. That night, the wind howled like a wounded animal. The moon hid behind thick storm clouds, drowning the forest in a blanket of darkness. Only the creaking lanterns outside the wooden cabins pierced the black. The townsfolk were asleep, until the sound of knocking shattered the silence. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, on the door of Reverend Elias Crow, the town's preacher. When he opened the door, a tall figure stood beneath the dripping eaves, drenched, pale and trembling. His clothes were torn, his boots caked with mud, his face gaunt as if he hadn't eaten for days. He whispered only one thing: "I am not from here." Reverend Crow assumed he meant another town, another state perhaps, but the man's cold grey eyes suggested something far stranger. His name, he claimed, was Samuel Hawthorne, and he said he came from another world. The Reverend took him inside, offering shelter by the fireplace, but Samuel refused food, refused water, refused even to sit down. Instead, he stared blankly at the flickering flames, whispering numbers under his breath. Numbers no one understood. "It's coming," he murmured. "They'll follow me here." No one knew what "they" meant. Not yet. By sunrise, news of the strange traveller spread across Hawthorne Creek. Some called him a lunatic. Others said he was cursed. But the sheriff, Henry McCall, didn't like mysteries. He ordered Samuel brought to the town hall for questioning. That's when things turned darker. When asked where he came from, Samuel pointed upward, beyond the ceiling, beyond the sky. "Not from your earth," he said in a low, trembling voice. "I crossed through the Bray. They'll come for me, and when they do, this place will burn." The townsfolk laughed nervously at first, until they saw the terror in his face. This wasn't an act. This was real. But before anyone could ask more, Samuel collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing violently. Witnesses swore his veins glowed faintly beneath his pale skin, as if something unnatural pulsed inside him. By nightfall, Hawthorne Creek was no longer the same quiet town it had always been, because Samuel Hawthorne had brought something with him, something that did not belong here. And that was only the beginning. Samuel awoke 2 days later in the old infirmary, sweating, trembling, his breath shallow and uneven. Dr. Clarence Whitmore leaned over him, wiping blood from his forehead, whispering, "Son, what's wrong with you?" Samuel's eyes opened slowly, and for the first time the doctor saw it. A strange, black mark crawled beneath Samuel's skin, just under his collarbone, like ink spreading through water. It pulsed faintly as though alive, and whenever Dr. Whitmore touched it, Samuel screamed with an agony that shook the rafters. Sheriff McCall demanded answers, but Samuel spoke in riddles. "The mark is a key," he whispered. "It opens the way, but once it opens, they'll never let you close it again." No one knew who they were. No one understood what the way meant. But the more they questioned him, the stranger things became. The weather turned violent. Sudden storms rolled in without warning. Animals fled the forests, and late at night the townsfolk began hearing whispers in the wind, voices speaking in a language no one recognized. Some claimed to see figures lurking at the tree line, tall, thin silhouettes with glowing eyes that disappeared when approached. Meanwhile, Samuel became more unstable. His nightmares grew violent, his screams waking the entire infirmary. He began scribbling symbols onto the walls, crude spiraling shapes that none of the elders recognized. Then came the first death. Martha Keating, the Reverend's wife, was found frozen solid in her cabin, though the fireplace still burned warm inside. Samuel was restrained immediately, accused of witchcraft. But when questioned, he simply whispered one thing over and over again: "It found her. It knows where we are." That night, Dr. Whitmore gathered a few men and returned to Samuel's bedside. They cut open the strange black mark beneath his skin, hoping to remove whatever disease infected him. What came out was not blood. A thick silver fluid spilled from the wound, moving unnaturally, almost alive. The doctor stepped back in horror, muttering prayers under his breath. Samuel looked at him and smiled for the first time. "Now, you've seen it." From that moment forward, nothing in Hawthorne Creek was ever the same. Within a week of Samuel's arrival, the forest began to change. Old paths vanished overnight, familiar trails twisted into new shapes, leading nowhere. Hunters reported strange stone structures hidden deep in the woods, monuments that hadn't been there before. Children went missing, 3 in just 2 days. The sheriff formed search parties, lanterns in hand, combing the forest for miles, but every time they entered the woods, their compasses spun wildly, their torches flickered, and an unnatural silence swallowed the trees. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. Meanwhile, Samuel kept warning them. "It's feeding," he whispered. "It takes the young first. Easier to cross over." When they pressed him for answers, he finally broke. "You think this is your world," he said, trembling violently. "But it isn't. This place, this whole place, is just a reflection. They found cracks in the glass, and now they're coming through." On the 5th night, the search party returned empty-handed, except for one thing, a child's shoe found near the creek. But the shoe was burnt, the leather warped and melted, as though it had been dipped in fire. The Reverend begged the sheriff to evacuate the town, but Samuel stopped him. "Run if you want," he said, his voice low and broken, "but there's nowhere to hide. Once the breach opens, the whole world changes." And then, on the 7th night, the woods screamed. The sound came at exactly 3:03 a.m., a long, unearthly wail that rolled through the valley, shaking every cabin, every window pane. Some swore the trees themselves bent toward the sound, as if listening. By sunrise, the forest floor was littered with dead birds, their bodies twisted, their eyes burned black. Whatever Samuel had brought with him was awake now. By the 2nd week after Samuel Hawthorne's arrival, Hawthorne Creek was no longer the same peaceful settlement it once was. The woods had grown silent, the air colder, and the townsfolk restless. People whispered about the curse, though no one dared say it aloud. But on the night of August 18th, 1897, fear became reality. 7-year-old Elias Turner, the blacksmith's youngest son, vanished without a trace. His mother swore she tucked him into bed at dusk. When she returned moments later with a glass of warm milk, his bed was empty. The window was open. The curtains, damp from the mist, fluttered inward. There were no footprints outside the cabin, no signs of forced entry, just nothing. Sheriff McCall gathered a search party of 15 men and stormed into the woods with lanterns, rifles, and hounds. For hours they combed the forest, calling Elias's name, but the hounds refused to move past the tree line. They whimpered, growled, then backed away, tails tucked, ears flat. One hunter, Thomas Reddick, swore he heard whispering just beyond the mist, a child's voice, laughing softly. When he followed it, he claimed the trees moved, shifting unnaturally, blocking his path like a living maze. He stumbled back to camp, pale, trembling, muttering, "The forest doesn't want us here." Meanwhile, Samuel, still bound in the infirmary, began laughing in his sleep. When Dr. Whitmore shook him awake, Samuel's eyes opened wide and black, pupils swallowed by darkness. "He's gone," he whispered hoarsely. "Taken for the crossing." The doctor demanded answers, but Samuel only repeated one phrase. "The young ones first, always the young ones." By dawn, Elias Turner was officially declared missing, but he wasn't the last. Within 3 days, 2 more children, Abigail Keating and Jonah Whitmore, the doctor's own son, vanished under the same mysterious circumstances. Doors locked from the inside, no signs of struggle, no trails to follow. Panic consumed the town. Mothers hid their children, men slept with rifles by their beds, and yet, every night, the wind carried faint cries, soft, childlike voices calling from deep within the forest. Then came the carvings. Dozens of strange spiral symbols appeared overnight on the trees surrounding Hawthorne Creek. No one saw who carved them, yet the symbols matched those Samuel had been drawing on the infirmary walls. When confronted, Samuel finally spoke. "The breach is opening." But before anyone could demand answers, a scream erupted from the woods, a sound so blood-chilling that the entire town rushed toward it. What they found would scar Hawthorne Creek forever. It was just after midnight when they found him. A man's body, half submerged in the shallow waters of Hawthorne Creek, his face frozen in a mask of horror, mouth open as if mid-scream. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his chest had been carved open. Inside, where his heart should have been, there was nothing. Dr. Whitmore knelt beside the corpse, trembling, whispering scripture under his breath. "No animal did this," he muttered, shaking his head. This was deliberate. But something else drew their attention. Carved into the man's chest was the same spiral symbol seen on the trees and Samuel's walls. Sheriff McCall ordered Samuel brought to the creek despite the doctor's protests. When Samuel saw the body, he collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest as if in pain. "It's here," he rasped, barely audible. "You let it in?" Confusion turned to anger as the sheriff shook him violently, demanding answers, but Samuel was incoherent, mumbling strange words in a language no one understood. And then the water moved. The surface of the creek rippled unnaturally, though the wind was still. Something stirred beneath, something large, shifting slowly in the black current. Suddenly, a hand, long, pale, skeletal, broke the surface before vanishing just as quickly. The men staggered back in terror, rifles raised, but Samuel screamed at them not to shoot. "It sees through sound," he cried. "If you draw its attention, it will know you." No one listened. The sheriff fired a single shot into the water. The creek screamed back. A sound unlike anything human erupted from beneath the surface, a guttural, ear-splitting roar that shattered the lanterns and sent the horses bolting into the woods. The men stumbled, covering their ears, some collapsing from the sheer force of it. When silence finally fell, the creek was still, but the body was gone. Ragged beneath the current. That night, the entire town gathered in the church, demanding answers from Reverend Crow. The Reverend, pale and trembling, held up Samuel's writings and claimed they were warnings. "He says there's a crossing," the Reverend whispered to the crowd, "a place between worlds, and he claims it has already begun." As the murmurs grew, the wind outside howled louder than ever. Some swore they heard footsteps on the church roof. 3 days later, the forest devoured the first cabin. It started with the Peterson family home on the edge of town. At dawn, their neighbors awoke to find the cabin gone. Not destroyed. Not burned. Simply gone. In its place was a patch of dead soil, cracked and blackened as though scorched by lightning. Sheriff McCall gathered his men and rode to the scene, only to find more spiral symbols carved into the surrounding trees. Samuel, still restrained, begged to be taken there. Against his better judgment, Dr. Whitmore agreed. When they arrived, Samuel collapsed to his knees, pressing his palm against the soil. "It's thin here," he whispered. "The veil between worlds. It's weakening." Suddenly the ground moved beneath them. A deep, rumbling vibration rolled through the earth and the air turned icy cold. The men backed away, clutching their rifles as the soil cracked open, revealing a faint, pulsing light beneath. And then they heard it. Whispers. Faint at first, like voices underwater, growing louder, closer, until the words became clear. "Samuel." Every man froze. "Samuel, come back to us." Sheriff McCall shouted into the void, demanding to know who they were. There was no answer, just laughter. Samuel screamed, falling backward, covering his ears as blood trickled from his nose. "It's them," he cried. "They found me." Before anyone could react, a hand shot out from the crack, long, blackened fingers tipped with jagged claws. The men fired wildly, bullets tearing into the soil, but the thing retreated, vanishing back into the ground. The rumbling stopped. The light faded. The earth closed, as if nothing had ever happened. Samuel lay shaking, whispering one final warning before losing consciousness. "This is just the beginning. The breach is opening everywhere." That night, the townsfolk gathered their families and prayed, but the prayers went unanswered, because by morning the second cabin was gone. By the third week after Samuel's arrival, Hawthorne Creek had transformed into something unrecognizable. People locked their doors before sunset, no one dared step outside after dark, and yet it came for them anyway. August the 23rd, 1897. A night the town would never forget. It began with the sound of howling, not wolves, not dogs, but something deeper, guttural and alien. The noise rippled through the valley like a living thing, rattling windows and shaking lanterns from their hooks. Inside the church, Reverend Crow gathered the frightened townsfolk for prayer. But midway through his sermon, the candles extinguished without warning, plunging the room into complete darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the inside of the church door. Sheriff McCall and his deputies rushed forward, rifles ready. When they swung the doors open, there was nothing but mist curling across the empty street, and then someone screamed. Outside, near the steps of the church, lay the body of Sarah Keating, her white nightgown drenched in blood, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Carved into her forehead was the spiral symbol, again. Panic erupted inside the church. Mothers clutched their children, men shouted for vengeance. The sheriff turned to Samuel, who was seated near the altar under heavy guard. Samuel didn't even look surprised. He simply whispered, almost calmly, "It's feeding now." The sheriff struck him across the face, furious. "You did this," he roared. But Samuel only laughed, a hollow, broken laugh that sent chills crawling up every spine in the room. Outside, the howling grew louder, closer. Then the window shattered. A dark, shifting shape moved across the street, massive, unnatural, with limbs too long and joints bending the wrong way. It darted between shadows faster than the eye could follow. The deputies opened fire, bullets echoing through the night, but every shot missed. "Don't shoot," Samuel yelled suddenly. "You can't kill what doesn't belong here." But it was too late. The thing moved. Before anyone could react, one of the deputies was dragged screaming into the mist, his voice fading into silence almost instantly. That night, 3 more people vanished, and 2 were found dead, their bodies mutilated in ways the doctor refused to describe. The townsfolk began to turn against Samuel entirely. Some demanded he be hanged, believing his presence had cursed Hawthorne Creek. Others feared killing him might make things worse. Dr. Whitmore begged the sheriff to keep Samuel alive. "He knows something," the doctor insisted. "If we kill him, we may never understand what we're facing." But Samuel remained silent for the rest of the night, rocking back and forth, repeating one phrase over and over again: "The breach is widening." By the following morning, strange spiral markings covered nearly every surface in Hawthorne Creek. They were carved into trees, scratched into doors, burned into the dirt roads, and even etched across windows. No one saw who made them. No one heard anyone carving, but they were everywhere. And Samuel's reaction terrified everyone. When Reverend Crow showed him one of the symbols carved into the church door, Samuel collapsed to his knees, clutching his temples. "You shouldn't have seen it," he whispered. "It's a call. They know you now." Dr. Whitmore and the Reverend pressed him for answers, forcing him to explain the markings. Slowly, Samuel began to speak, his voice trembling, broken. "They're coordinates," he said. "Not for places, but for veins, cracks between this world and the next. Once they're marked, they stay open, forever." The Reverend paled. "Who marked them, Samuel?" He looked up at him, his grey eyes hollow. "Not people. That day the sheriff sent men to cut down the marked trees, hoping to erase the symbols. But by nightfall, the symbols reappeared, etched deeper than before, as though carved by something beneath the bark itself. And then the dreams began. Nearly every resident of Hawthorne Creek reported the same nightmare, standing in a black field beneath a dead, crimson sky, while hundreds of figures with eyeless faces whispered in unison, "Give him back." Children woke screaming in the night, clawing at their own skin. Adults refused to sleep at all, terrified they wouldn't wake up again. Dr. Whitmore discovered something worse. On the 4th night, he found Jonah Whitmore's shoe, his missing son, nailed to the infirmary wall, drenched in silver fluid identical to what had spilled from Samuel's wound weeks earlier. When he confronted Samuel, shaking him violently, Samuel finally broke his silence. "You don't understand," he said. "Aid," his voice cracking. "They're not taking them. They're changing them." The doctor froze. Changing them into what? Samuel looked at him with hollow eyes and whispered, "Into them." That same night, the church bell began ringing on its own. No one was inside the church. The ringing continued for 7 minutes straight. By the time the townsfolk arrived, the doors of the church stood wide open, and the interior was lit by dozens of candles arranged in a spiral across the floor. At the center of the spiral lay Martha Crowe, the Reverend's niece, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Her wrists bled where she'd struggled against the ropes. When they untied her, she screamed a single word over and over again: "Voices!" The Reverend knelt beside her, holding her trembling hands. "What voices, Martha?" She shook her head violently, sobbing. Not from here." Samuel, who had been dragged to the church under guard, stared at the spiral of candles, his lips moving silently. Finally he whispered, "This isn't your church anymore." Suddenly the candles extinguished in unison, plunging the room into pitch blackness. And then the walls began to breathe. Witnesses swore they saw the wooden panels of the church expanding and contracting as though inhaling, the beams groaning under invisible weight. The air grew suffocatingly hot, thick with the smell of sulfur and rot. Then came the chanting. Soft at first, almost like distant humming, until the words became clear. A language no one recognized, spoken by voices that didn't belong to anyone in the room. The sheriff barked orders, but the chanting only grew louder, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. And then, without warning, a hole tore open in the ceiling. A jagged, swirling void, bleeding silver light. From within, something moved. A figure. Tall, thin, with limbs too long, crawling down the church wall like a spider. Its eyeless face turned toward Samuel, and in a voice deeper than thunder, it spoke a single phrase. "Return what is ours." Samuel collapsed, clutching his head, screaming. "I can't," he cried. "It won't let me." The sheriff fired at the creature. But the bullet passed through it as though through smoke. The thing's head turned, unnaturally slow, toward the rest of the townsfolk, and then it vanished. The chanting stopped. The candles relit on their own. The spiral of wax melted into symbols no one could decipher. From that night forward, the church was abandoned. But Samuel warned them it was already too late. "The breach," he whispered, barely conscious. "It's open now, and they know where we are." The morning after the church incident, a thick, unnatural fog settled over Hawthorne Creek. It swallowed the entire valley, smothering every cabin, every tree, every street in ghostly silence. People woke to find their windows coated in condensation, but the moisture wasn't water, it was silver. Thin streaks of shimmering liquid dripped down the glass, glowing faintly in the early light. Samuel's eyes went wide the moment he saw it. "They're close," he whispered. "The veil is almost gone." That same morning, Sheriff McCall organized his largest search party yet, 30 armed men, determined to find the missing children. Dr. Whitmore, gaunt from lack of sleep, led the group deep into the woods, where the mist grew thicker with every step. For hours they wandered without direction. Compasses spun uselessly, lanterns flickered violently, and the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, wind, were nowhere to be heard. Then they found the stone circle. Hidden beneath the fog, it stood silently in a clearing, 11 ancient monoliths forming a perfect spiral around a deep, jagged pit. On each stone were carved the same spiral symbols seen across town, etched so deep they looked burned into the rock. At the edge of the pit lay something small, a doll, Abigail Keating's doll. Dr. Whitmore trembled as he picked it up, realizing the seams of the doll were wet with the same silver fluid from Samuel's wound. But before anyone could speak, a soft humming rose from the pit below. At first it sounded like a child singing. Then they realized it was all 3 missing children. Sheriff McCall ordered ropes tied to the nearest stones. Against the protests of several deputies, two men descended slowly into the darkness, lanterns swinging, but before they reached the bottom, their screams tore through the silence. The ropes jerked violently, then went slack. When they pulled the men back up, both were gone. Only the ropes returned. That night, panic swallowed Hawthorne Creek whole. Families packed whatever they could carry, preparing to abandon the settlement entirely. But Samuel begged them to stay. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "It's not the woods they want. It's not the land. It's us. If you leave, they'll follow." Some didn't listen. 4 families fled into the darkness before sunrise. None of them were ever seen again. The next evening, Dr. Whitmore awoke to the sound of knocking on his cabin door. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks. When he opened the door, his knees nearly buckled. It was Jonah, his missing son. The boy stood barefoot in the mist, his nightshirt drenched, his pale skin glistening under the lantern light. His small hands trembled, his lips blue, but his wide, glassy eyes stared directly into his father's soul. "Jonah," the doctor whispered, voice cracking as tears blurred his vision. He pulled the boy into his arms, sobbing, clutching him tightly. But Jonah didn't hug him back. The sheriff arrived moments later, followed by several townsfolk, all staring in shock. When they asked where the boy had been, Jonah simply tilted his head, his voice strange and hollow. "I was never gone." Samuel, seated in the corner under guard, began to shake violently. "Don't touch him," he screamed. "That's not your son anymore." The doctor ignored him, falling to his knees and cupping Jonah's face. "It's okay, son. You're safe now." Jonah slowly turned his head to meet his father's gaze, and then he smiled. It was wrong. Too wide. Too sharp. And then Jonah whispered something that froze the blood in every man's veins. "We opened the door, Father. We're not alone anymore." Before anyone could react, Jonah's eyes turned black, his pupils vanishing entirely as his small body convulsed violently. From his mouth spilled the same silver fluid they had seen before, coating the wooden floor. Then, just as suddenly, Jonah stopped moving. His body collapsed, lifeless, but the silver liquid kept moving, slithering across the ground like it was alive. Samuel shouted for everyone to back away, screaming, "It's a carrier! Kill it before it calls the others!" The sheriff raised his rifle and fired, shattering the lantern on the floor. Flames erupted instantly, burning the cabin wall. But when the smoke cleared, the silver was gone. So was Jonah's body. That night, no one in Hawthorne Creek slept. Because if Jonah had returned like this, the others would too. Samuel had stopped eating. He sat silently in the infirmary, shackled to the bed, his lips cracked and pale, his body trembling violently with every passing hour. Dr. Whitmore begged him to speak, to explain, but Samuel remained quiet, until Reverend Crow brought him something unexpected. It was an old journal, found buried beneath the church's floorboards during its construction decades earlier. The leather cover was burned, the pages brittle, but the words inside, they were written in the same strange symbols Samuel had been carving into the walls. The Reverend placed the book on Samuel's lap. "Tell us what this means." Samuel stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at them with hollow eyes. "This isn't the first time," he whispered. "This place, Hawthorne Creek. It's happened here before." Dr. Whitmore frowned. "What happened before?" Samuel slowly flipped through the pages, tracing the faded ink with his trembling fingers. "A breach," he said softly. "It opened here centuries ago. An entire settlement vanished overnight. Every soul taken. They called it the Devouring." Reverend Crow crossed himself, pale and shaking. "Taken by who, Samuel?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Not who," he said. "What?" He explained that the entities weren't from another planet, as they had assumed, but from another layer of existence, a place beneath reality itself, a shadow world where time folds and living things are reshaped. "They want the breach open," Samuel whispered. "Once it's fully formed, they'll pour through, and nothing here will survive." The doctor slammed his fist against the table. "Then close it." Samuel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I can't. I was sent here to open it." The room went silent. Reverend Crow's voice trembled as he spoke. "You brought them here?" Samuel nodded slowly, tears finally streaming down his pale cheeks. "I thought I could control it," he said softly, "but once you start, it never stops." Before anyone could respond, the church bell rang again, 3 long, deafening tolls. The sound wasn't coming from the bell tower. It was coming from beneath the ground. Samuel looked up at the ceiling, his face pale, whispering one final warning. "They've found the heart of the breach." And then the floor began to crack. The sound of the bell beneath the ground didn't stop. Each toll reverberated through the earth, shaking the wooden floorboards, rattling lanterns, and making the air itself vibrate inside the chest of every man and woman in the infirmary. Sheriff McCall stumbled backward, clutching the wall for balance. "That's impossible," he whispered hoarsely. "The church doesn't have a bell down there." But Samuel only stared at the ceiling, pale and motionless, his lips barely parted as he whispered, "It's waking up." A sudden groaning erupted from beneath the floorboards, like something vast and heavy was shifting in the depths below. Dust rained down from the rafters, and the sound of splintering wood echoed from the far end of the street outside. Dr. Whitmore ran to the window and froze. The ground was moving. Across Hawthorne Creek, the dirt streets heaved like waves, rising and falling in slow, unnatural pulses, as though the entire town sat atop something breathing. The townsfolk began to gather outside, their terrified voices rising in chaos. Mothers clutched their children, men gripped rifles, and Reverend Crow fell to his knees, praying loudly for mercy. Then the silver mist returned. It rolled silently between the cabins, curling around fences, lantern posts, and doorframes until visibility dropped to nothing. The sound of distant footsteps approached through the fog, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Sheriff McCall raised his rifle, scanning the mist. "Hold your ground," he ordered, and then they emerged. The children, not just Jonah. All 3 missing children walked out of the haze in a straight line, their bare feet silent against the damp earth, their small hands twitching violently as though pulled by invisible strings. Behind them came others, the 4 families who had fled days earlier, their faces pale and stretched, eyes completely black like pools of ink. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, marionette-like. Dr. Whitmore's voice cracked as he whispered, "Dear God, what have they done to them?" Samuel pulled against his shackles, screaming, "It's not them anymore. You have to burn them." The sheriff hesitated. "Those are my people, Hawthorne." "No," Samuel rasped, shaking his head violently. "Those are the first vessels." Before anyone could act, the ground split open behind the children. A violent blast of cold air erupted upward, carrying with it an inhuman chorus of whispers, dozens of overlapping voices speaking in a language no one understood. The earth itself seemed to scream as something vast shifted beneath it. And then, silence. The children's heads tilted in perfect unison, their dead eyes turning toward the infirmary window, and they smiled. Night fell over Hawthorne Creek like a heavy curtain. The entire settlement gathered in the church, the only place sturdy enough to serve as refuge. Lanterns lined the altar, casting long shadows against the walls, and every pew was filled with terrified faces. Samuel sat restrained at the front, his hands bound, but his voice commanded the room. "You need to understand," he said hoarsely. "What's happening isn't random. The breach feeds on fear, on memory. The more you panic, the faster it spreads." Reverend Crow slammed his fist against the pulpit. "Blasphemy! This is not some hole in reality. This is punishment. You brought the devil among us." Samuel locked eyes with him, his voice low, cold. "I wish it were the devil." The tension broke when one of the children, little Abigail Keating, appeared in the doorway of the church. Her small figure stood motionless, framed in the lantern light. Dr. Whitmore ran to her, tears streaming down his face. "Abby, sweetheart, it's all right now. You're safe." But the moment he touched her shoulder, she turned her head toward him, and her jaw unhinged. A piercing, inhuman screech tore through the church, so loud the lantern flames shuddered and several glass panes shattered instantly. People screamed, covering their ears, but Abigail didn't move. From her open mouth, the silver fluid poured freely, spilling across the wooden floor like living mercury. It slithered toward the nearest pew, climbing up the legs of one man, forcing itself beneath his skin. He convulsed violently, collapsing as his veins turned black within seconds. Samuel roared over the chaos. "Don't let it touch you! Burn it now!" Sheriff McCall grabbed a lantern and hurled it at the spreading liquid. The flames erupted instantly, igniting the floorboards, and Abigail's small body collapsed into ash without a sound. But then the whispers returned. They weren't coming from Abigail. They were coming from everywhere. Dozens of voices, men, women, children, spoke in perfect unison, overlapping in tones that made the walls shake. The door is open. The light beneath the skin awakens. Hawthorne will be the first, but not the last. And then, all at once, the lanterns extinguished. For a moment, the church fell into complete, suffocating darkness. And in that darkness, something moved. Screams erupted in the pitch-black church. People shoved each other, knocking over pews, clawing their way toward the door, but the entrance wouldn't budge. It was as though the wood itself had fused shut. A soft hissing sound filled the air, wet and sharp, like steam escaping from deep within the walls. And then they saw it. In the faint glow of the dying embers, a shape slithered along the ceiling, its form shifting, never staying solid for more than a second. It was humanoid, but wrong. Limbs bending backward, spine arching unnaturally, ribs jutting from translucent flesh. Its face. There wasn't one. Just smooth, pale skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. Reverend Crow began chanting prayers desperately, clutching his crucifix, but the thing turned toward him and dropped soundlessly from the ceiling. The priest's body was lifted effortlessly into the air, as though gripped by invisible hands. For a moment he hung there, suspended, and then his chest split open without a blade touching him. A blinding light burst from his body, illuminating the entire church in a horrifying glow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became deafening. The veil is thin. They are already here. The flesh is the door. Dr. Whitmore tried to drag the priest's body away, but Samuel shouted, "Don't touch him! It's feeding!" Before anyone could react, the eyeless creature folded into itself and vanished, as though sucked into a space that shouldn't exist. Then the church doors blew open violently, and the cold night air rushed in. Outside, the mist had thickened into an impenetrable wall. Shapes moved within it, dozens, maybe hundreds, flickering in and out of sight like shadows cast by an unseen fire. Samuel looked out into the fog, his voice hollow and shaking. "This isn't an invasion," he said softly. "It's a harvest." And somewhere deep beneath the earth, the bell tolled again. 3 times. The night was silent, but it wasn't calm. Outside the church, the mist had grown so thick it seemed alive, rolling in slow spirals that reached toward the rooftops. Shapes flickered within it, human, animal, and something far worse, their outlines never staying solid long enough to comprehend. Inside, chaos still reigned. The few remaining lanterns cast flickering shadows across terrified faces. Samuel sat hunched against the wall, his shackles broken during the struggle, his breathing shallow but steady. Sheriff McCall knelt beside him. "If you know something, you better start talking, Hawthorne. What are we dealing with?" Samuel's pale eyes lifted slowly, focusing on the sheriff as if seeing him for the first time. His voice was hoarse, broken, yet deliberate. "We are standing on the skin of it." Dr. Whitmore frowned. "The skin of what?" "The thing you call this world," Samuel whispered. "But it isn't solid, it's layered. We are on the top layer, and something underneath has been trying to shed us for a very, very long time." Before the sheriff could reply, a muffled scream erupted from the back of the church. One of the townsfolk, Martha Keating, Abigail's mother, clutched her throat, gagging violently. Her nails tore at her own skin as a bulge formed beneath her jawline, something pulsing beneath the flesh. Dr. Whitmore rushed to her side, holding her shoulders. "Martha, breathe. Stay with me." But it wasn't Martha anymore. The bulge beneath her skin moved rapidly, sliding upward until something sharp tore through her lips. Thin, black tendrils writhing like roots seeking sunlight. Her eyes rolled back, veins darkening beneath translucent skin as her jaw split unnaturally wide. Sheriff McCall raised his rifle, but Samuel shouted, "Don't shoot her! It's using her!" Before anyone could process his words, the tendrils exploded outward, whipping violently across the room, piercing wooden pews and ripping deep grooves into the floorboards. Several townsfolk screamed, scrambling toward the walls as one tendril lashed across the ceiling, leaving behind a trail of glimmering silver residue. Samuel lunged forward, grabbing the burning remains of a lantern, and hurled it directly at Martha's body. The flames consumed her instantly, but she didn't scream. Instead, a chorus of voices erupted from her body, layered and overlapping, echoing inside every skull. The door opens. They are under your feet. You are all inside us. And then her body collapsed into a heap of ashen fragments, the silver residue evaporating into the mist seeping beneath the church doors. Samuel stood motionless, trembling, whispering almost to himself. They've started feeding. The survivors gathered near the altar, fear carved deep into their faces. Reverend Crowe sat slumped against the wall, clutching his crucifix with bloodied hands, whispering silent prayers under his breath. Dr. Whitmore confronted Samuel, his voice sharp, nearly trembling. You keep talking in riddles. Start making sense. What are they? What are you? Samuel closed his eyes for a long moment before answering. I'm not from here, he said finally, his voice low, steady, and deliberate. A hush fell over the church. I come from a place where your sun never rises, he continued, a place beneath the skin of your world, beneath all worlds. I was sent here to find the breach, and to close it. Sheriff McCall scoffed bitterly. Close it. You've done nothing but make things worse. Samuel's pale gaze turned cold. The breach was already open when I arrived. Every child taken, every body changed. It's their way of anchoring themselves here. They need vessels. Dr. Whitmore shook his head, struggling to process. But why here? Why Hawthorne Creek? Samuel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Because this town was built on their grave. The words hit like thunder. Reverend Crowe stopped praying and slowly raised his head, his face ashen. What do you mean? Samuel turned toward the warped floorboards, pointing downward. This entire settlement was founded on top of an ancient burial pit, one you disturbed when you dug your wells and laid your foundations. You didn't find water, you found them. Suddenly, a deep, resonant vibration shook the church, like the growl of something massive waking beneath the earth. Dust drifted from the rafters, and the pews creaked under their weight. And then, a bell tolled again. 3 deafening, hollow strikes that reverberated through the ground, through bone and marrow, making several people collapse, clutching their ears. Samuel stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. That's not a bell, he whispered. That's a heartbeat. Outside, the mist shifted violently, swirling into spirals until something vast and humanoid formed within it. 2 towering silhouettes emerged, their proportions wrong, their heads tilting in opposite directions, limbs too long and bending at unnatural angles. Reverend Crowe began screaming scripture as the church walls groaned loudly, splintering beneath invisible pressure. Samuel grabbed a torch, thrusting it into the sheriff's hands. If we don't burn the root, Hawthorne dies. Sheriff McCall swallowed hard, his voice cracking. Where's the root? Samuel turned toward the earth below them. Exactly where you buried your dead. They had no choice. By dawn, the survivors, just 14 left out of nearly 80, gathered outside the church. The mist had receded slightly, forming a narrow path toward the edge of town, where the old graveyard sloped into a cluster of ancient oaks. Samuel led the way, carrying nothing but a rusted lantern and a long, jagged blade of blackened steel he'd taken from his satchel, a weapon not forged on earth. Dr. Whitmore followed closely behind, whispering quietly to himself, his fingers twitching nervously. Sheriff McCall walked last, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning every shadow. The graveyard was silent. Dozens of weathered stones leaned at odd angles, some half swallowed by earth, others shattered entirely. The ground felt soft beneath their boots. Too soft. Stay close, Samuel murmured, crouching near a collapsed mausoleum. He brushed away the moss and loose dirt, revealing a series of spiral carvings etched deep into the stone. Reverend Crowe frowned. Is that writing? Samuel nodded grimly. It's not meant for you to read. It's a warning. The carvings pulsed faintly, as though alive, glowing with a silver-blue light beneath the surface, and then the ground breathed again, slow, heavy, wet. Suddenly, a distant scream echoed through the woods behind them. Sheriff McCall spun, rifle raised. "Who's there?" But the sound wasn't human. A low, guttural clicking came from the tree line, followed by dozens of smaller clicks, overlapping in chaotic rhythm. Shapes moved between the oaks, pale and spidery, crawling on elongated limbs. Samuel's grip on his blade tightened. "They've found us." The first creature burst into view, its jaw split into 4 segments, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. It lunged forward, shrieking, and Samuel met it mid-air, driving the blackened blade through its chest. The creature convulsed violently before collapsing into dust, but more followed. Dozens. The survivors formed a defensive circle, swinging torches and firing rifles wildly as the creatures advanced in waves. The mist thickened again, muffling their screams, swallowing the gunfire. And then the earth split open beneath the mausoleum, revealing a yawning black pit. A rush of icy wind poured out, carrying whispers in that same impossible language, and the smell of rotting meat. Samuel turned to the others, his voice low, steady, unshaken. "Down there. That's where it started." Dr. Whitmore hesitated, shaking his head. "We'll die if we go down there." Samuel looked at him, expression cold, unreadable. "We'll die if we don't." And with that, Samuel descended into the pit. As the heartbeat below grew louder, the pit yawned below like the open maw of a beast, its walls slick with moisture and dark with age. The air pouring out was cold and damp, carrying the smell of iron, wet stone, and something rotten buried deep within the earth. Samuel lowered himself slowly, his blackened blade gripped tightly, his pale eyes reflecting the dim silver glow rising from somewhere far below. Behind him, Dr. Whitmore followed hesitantly, his boots slipping on the damp stone. Sheriff McCall came next, rifle in hand, muttering curses under his breath, while the remaining survivors, barely a dozen now, descended one by one into the ancient hollow beneath Hawthorne Creek. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, pressing against their lungs like damp cloth, and the sound of the heartbeat grew louder. Not metaphorical, not imagined. A real living heartbeat somewhere below. Thump, thump, thump. The walls were carved with spiraling glyphs, hundreds of them, glowing faintly with a phosphorescent silver light that pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat. The symbols weren't random. They moved, rearranging themselves when no one was looking, forming patterns that seemed almost alive. Reverend Crow traced one trembling hand across a carving, whispering, "God forgive us." Samuel turned sharply. "Don't touch them." "Why not?" the Reverend asked, voice cracking. "Because they're not carvings," Samuel said, his tone flat. "They're veins." The group froze. Before they could respond, the heartbeat grew faster, louder, as though aware of their presence. A deep, resonant rumble shook the tunnel, sending dust cascading from above. And then came the whispers, not from any one direction, but from everywhere at once, reverberating off the walls, vibrating inside their skulls. "Welcome back. The door remains open. The feast awaits." Dr. Whitmore stumbled, clutching his ears, his voice breaking. "Make it stop. Oh God, make it stop." Samuel stepped forward, unshaken, his voice low, almost reverent. "They know we're here." Suddenly the narrow tunnel widened into a massive underground cavern. A chasm stretched out before them, impossible in scale, lit by rivers of liquid silver that flowed like veins through the stone. Stalactites dripped with viscous black fluid, and far below something moved, vast, slow, and alive. The ground beneath them trembled as the thing below shifted its weight. What is that?" Sheriff McCall whispered. Samuel stared downward, his voice almost breaking for the first time. "That's not a what." He turned to face them, pale and grim. "That's who they buried." The cavern's air was thick now, humming with static, every breath tasting faintly of metal. Down below, the creature's bulk sprawled beneath layers of semi-transparent membrane, its colossal ribs visible beneath shifting pale flesh that pulsed in time with the endless heartbeat. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something older, something that didn't belong to this world. Samuel walked to the edge, kneeling carefully, his voice just above a whisper. "This is what your ancestors found when they dug the wells. They thought it was stone, but it was bone. They built Hawthorne Creek on its grave, thinking it was dead. But it isn't." Dr. Whitmore stared downward, pale and trembling. "It's alive?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Barely. They've been feeding it. Every missing child, every hollowed body, every dream you've had where your own skin feels wrong, it's connected to this." Suddenly, one of the survivors screamed. Emily Carter, a young woman who had lost her husband days earlier, was staring at her arm, watching in horror as black veins began creeping beneath her skin, racing upward like wildfire. Samuel lunged toward her, slicing open the sleeve of her dress, revealing tiny worm-like filaments writhing beneath her flesh. "It's trying to use her," Samuel said sharply. "Hold her down." Sheriff McCall and Dr. Whitmore pinned her to the ground as Samuel plunged the blackened blade deep into the earth beside her. The silver veins along the cavern walls flared and the worms beneath her skin began burning away, emitting tiny curls of smoke. Emily screamed until her voice gave out, finally collapsing, unconscious but alive. Reverend Crowe stumbled backward, clutching his crucifix tightly. "This is hell," he whispered. "This is where he sends the wicked." Samuel turned sharply, his pale gaze cutting into him. "This isn't hell, Reverend. This is older than your heaven or your God." And then, without warning, the creature's eye opened. The entire cavern shook violently, rocks splitting and dust raining from above. A single, massive golden eye, buried beneath layers of translucent flesh, rolled upward, its pupil contracting unnaturally as it focused on them. The heartbeat stopped. For one horrifying moment, the cavern was silent. Then a voice, not heard but felt, exploded inside their minds. "You should not be here." Every survivor collapsed, screaming, blood pouring from their noses and ears. The golden eye dilated, and the rivers of silver below began to boil. Samuel, shaking violently, raised his blade toward the eye. "We close the breach tonight," he whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the roar of the rising winds. The cavern shifted violently, throwing survivors to the ground. Massive tremors rippled through the tunnels above, collapsing stone columns and sealing their path back to the surface. They were trapped. The heartbeat resumed, faster, louder, frantic now, and with each pulse the silver rivers surged upward, licking the walls like liquid fire. Sheriff McCall shouted over the chaos. "Hawthorne, tell me how we stop this thing." Samuel didn't look at him, his pale eyes fixed on the spiral glyphs lining the walls. "We can't kill it," he said flatly, "but we can starve it." Dr. Whitmore shouted, panicked. "Starve it? Of what?" Samuel turned slowly, his voice cold as stone. "Us." Before anyone could respond, dozens of shapes began emerging from the silver rivers, humanoid figures, their bodies semi-transparent, faces blurred as though half-formed. They moved unnaturally, limbs bending backward, their mouths stretching wide as a low, harmonic moan filled the cavern. The survivors formed a tight circle, torches raised, weapons ready. One of the creatures lunged, and Sheriff McCall fired point blank, but the bullet passed through, splintering harmlessly against stone. The creature didn't stop. Samuel stepped forward, slashing downward with the blackened blade. As the steel touched the figure's body, it screamed, a sound so sharp and violent it cracked one of the nearby stalactites. The creature dissolved into ash instantly. "Only this blade can hurt them," Samuel said. "Stay behind me." The survivors slowly retreated toward a narrow stone ledge overlooking the chasm, but the creatures kept coming, dozens, maybe hundreds, crawling from the rivers like insects. The golden eye below tracked their every move, unblinking, patient. And then the whispers returned, louder than before, layered with hundreds of overlapping voices. "Eat, Feed. Become. Samuel grabbed Reverend Crow by the collar, pulling him close. Reverend, the glyphs. Start reciting them. Backward. Crow's eyes went wide. I don't know how. You don't need to know, Samuel snapped. Just speak. Trembling, the Reverend began chanting the impossible symbols aloud, his voice shaky at first, then growing steadier. The effect was immediate. The silver rivers recoiled, hissing violently. The humanoid figures screeched, collapsing into dust one by one. The heartbeat faltered, slower now, weaker, but the golden eye remained wide open. And then Samuel whispered something that froze every soul in the cavern. It's waking up. The chanting grew louder, echoing through the hollow like waves crashing against stone. Reverend Crow's trembling voice carried the alien syllables Samuel had forced into his mind, each sound twisting unnaturally, bending the air around them. The glyphs pulsed brighter, responding to the Reverend's broken cadence. The ground shook violently, and for the first time, the golden eye below blinked. And then, the silver rivers screamed. Not figuratively. They screamed. A high, keening wail that made every bone in their bodies ache. Steam rose violently as the liquid boiled and churned, forming spiraling columns around the humanoid figures clawing their way from the depths. Dr. Whitmore covered his ears, shouting over the chaos. It's reacting. We're hurting it. Samuel didn't respond. He wasn't chanting. He wasn't fighting. He was listening. His pale eyes locked on the far side of the cavern where the silver veins formed a single spiraling doorway etched into the stone. Through the gaps in reality, Samuel could see shadows moving, long, spindly shapes shifting on the other side, pressing against the thin barrier like hungry moths against glass. They're coming, Samuel murmured under his breath. Sheriff McCall grabbed his arm. What the hell are you talking about? Samuel's face was drained of all color. This thing, it isn't alone. Before McCall could reply, the membrane sealing the spiraling doorway split open like wet paper. A blast of freezing air tore through the cavern, extinguishing torches and plunging half the chamber into shadow. From beyond the doorway, hands emerged, thin, grey, fingerless limbs, slick with something dark and glistening. They didn't crawl so much as unfold, bending in impossible angles as more and more of the creatures pulled themselves through. The survivors screamed as the first one fully emerged, a figure 8 feet tall, its flesh translucent and veined with silver light, its face completely smooth save for a single vertical slit that opened slowly, revealing rows of small, glass-like teeth. Reverend Crow dropped mid-chant, frozen in terror. Dear God! Samuel stepped forward, blade raised, his voice sharp and commanding. There is no God here. Move! He swung the blackened blade with unnatural speed, severing the creature's torso cleanly. Its body collapsed into a cloud of pale ash that evaporated instantly, but 3 more crawled out of the breach to replace it. The survivors scrambled backward, pressed against the cavern wall, their torches barely holding back the advancing swarm. Dr. Whitmore shouted, Samuel, there are too many. Samuel didn't turn, then stopped thinking like prey. And then something changed. The heartbeat beneath the cavern walls slowed, but the whispers grew louder. Thousands of overlapping voices speaking in unison, shaping words the human ear could barely comprehend. We awake. We remember. We hunger. The golden eye shifted its gaze, and a single beam of blinding light erupted upward, striking the ceiling and tearing a vertical crack through the stone. For the first time since they'd entered, there was a way out. But Samuel didn't move toward it. Instead, he whispered to himself too softly for anyone else to hear. It's almost time. The survivors stumbled toward the crack of light above, desperate to escape, but Samuel remained rooted where he stood, staring into the spiraling breach where the creatures kept pouring through. Dr. Whitmore turned back, grabbing his arm. Samuel, we have to go. Samuel finally turned his pale gaze toward him, and for the first time, the doctor stepped back in fear. Samuel's pupils were gone. His irises now glimmered faintly, reflecting the same silver light running through the veins of the cavern walls. I can't leave, Samuel said quietly. Not yet. Sheriff McCall shouted angrily. What the hell do you mean, not yet? Samuel's lips parted slightly, and his voice, calm, measured, inhumanly steady, carried through the chaos. "Because I'm the reason it's awake." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, even the creatures seemed to pause, their movements slowing as if listening. Dr. Whitmore shook his head violently. No, that doesn't make sense. You've been fighting this thing since we got here." Samuel smiled faintly, coldly. "I've been keeping it asleep." The survivors froze. He slowly unbuttoned his tattered coat, revealing the scars carved into his chest. Spiraling glyphs burned deep into his flesh, glowing faintly beneath the skin. "I was born for this," he whispered. "Not human, not entirely. My blood, it comes from them." Reverend Crow dropped his crucifix, backing away as though burned. "Demon," he gasped. "You're a demon." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Names are meaningless here, Reverend. What I am doesn't matter. What matters is that this blade," he raised the blackened weapon, its silver veins pulsing, "was made from their bones, and it's the only thing that can close the breach." Sheriff McCall's voice cracked. "And if we don't?" Samuel turned his gaze toward the golden eye below. "Then this world ends tonight." Suddenly the entire cavern lurched violently, sending rocks crashing down. The breach widened and dozens more of the towering creatures surged forward, their harmonic moans rattling the survivors' teeth. Samuel grabbed Dr. Whitmore by the shoulder, shoving him toward the crack of light above. "Get them out, now." "What about you?" the doctor shouted. Samuel's pale lips curled faintly upward. "I was never meant to leave." And then, before anyone could stop him, Samuel leapt straight into the swarm of creatures, his blade cutting arcs of light through the darkness. The last thing they heard before the cavern swallowed him whole was Samuel laughing. Above, the survivors scrambled through the jagged crack in the stone, emerging into the ruins of Hawthorne Creek. The town was gone. Buildings collapsed. Streets split open into yawning fissures. The sky overhead churned violently, lit by pulses of silver lightning striking downward into the ground. From beneath their feet, a deep vibration rolled, not from the earth but from something alive, stirring far below. Dr. Whitmore collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, while Reverend Crow stood silently, staring into the horizon, where a colossal silhouette now rose from beneath the hills. It wasn't the creature itself. It was its shadow. The golden eye beneath the cavern had opened fully now, projecting a vast circular halo of light across the clouds above, spinning slowly as if searching. Sheriff McCall turned on Dr. Whitmore, his voice cracking. "Tell me we stopped it. Tell me Hawthorne's still alive down there." Before the doctor could answer, the ground beneath them exploded upward, hurling debris and flame in every direction. A towering creature, one of the breachborn, erupted from the earth, its translucent body glowing faintly from within, veins of silver energy coursing beneath its pale skin. Reverend Crow raised his crucifix, screaming prayers into the wind, but the creature struck him aside effortlessly, hurling him into the shattered remains of a farmhouse. McCall fired round after round, bullets tearing through the thing's body, but doing nothing to slow it. Dr. Whitmore shouted over the roar of thunder, "The glyphs, they're still active. If we destroy them, we cut off its anchor." Before they could act, the air split with a sudden scream, low, guttural, impossibly loud. Samuel. He emerged from the collapsing cavern below, his body drenched in silver light, the blackened blade now fused to his arm, becoming part of him. His pale skin shimmered unnaturally, veins glowing beneath the surface. But his voice was no longer entirely his own. "Back!" Samuel's command shook the air itself. The towering creature froze mid-motion, trembling violently before dissolving into ash. Dr. Whitmore stared at him in horror. "Samuel, what did you do?" Samuel's expression was unreadable. "I didn't do anything," he said softly, eyes glowing brighter now. "It chose me." The sky blackened. Lightning tore across the horizon, splitting the heavens into violent fragments. The ground heaved beneath them as the golden eye above pulsed faster and faster, each flash sending waves of power rolling across the valley. Samuel turned slowly, his gaze fixed on the spiraling breach, still glowing faintly beneath the cracked earth. "It's not over," he said quietly. "The last seal is still open." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward cautiously. "Samuel, if you close it, what happens to you?" Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he began carving symbols into the dirt with the tip of his fused blade, the glyphs burning faintly as he whispered in a language no human throat should have been able to produce. Reverend Crow, half-conscious and bloodied, croaked, You're not coming back, are you?" Samuel's pale eyes met his. "I was never supposed to be here." And then the ground split wide, revealing the heart of the ancient thing, a pulsating mass of flesh and light, beating faster and faster until the air itself screamed with vibration. The voices returned, thousands upon thousands overlapping into one terrible command: "Feed, feed, feed." Samuel raised the blackened blade high, chanting louder, faster, as the glyphs around him erupted with violent silver fire. The heartbeat faltered. The golden eye above dimmed. The creatures screamed, and hundreds of them, writhing violently before collapsing into piles of grey ash. But the seal fought back. Tendrils of living shadow burst from the breach, wrapping around Samuel's limbs, pulling him toward the chasm. He didn't resist. He only whispered one last phrase, his voice layered with something inhuman. "I'm going home." The blackened blade plunged downward, striking the heart dead center. The ground erupted in a column of silver light so blinding it turned night into day. For a moment, there was silence. When it faded, the breach was gone. The eye was closed, the silver rivers were dry, and Samuel Hawthorne was nowhere to be found. Dr. Whitmore collapsed, sobbing, while Sheriff McCall stared blankly at the scorched earth where the breach had once been. Reverend Crow whispered hoarsely, "God, forgive us." Above them, the storm began to clear. But deep beneath the earth, where the light could not reach, something stirred. Because some doors are never truly closed,